In this video, we're going to continue testing and we're going to move on to actually writing real tests for our Expensify application. And we're going to start with some of the simplest code that we have, and that would be the action generators. So these aren't very complex, which means they're going to be pretty easy to test, and that's going to allow us to ease into testing. Then we'll quickly move on to more complex things like reducers, selectors, and components. But to kick things off, we're going to start with the expenses action generators. So there are 3 functions inside of here, and we're just going to write a little bit of code that makes sure the functions work as expected. So to kick things off, we do need to create a test file for this one. And what we're going to do is essentially clone the folders that are in source inside of tests. So if I'm trying to write a test file for the expenses action generators, all I do is I create an actions folder inside of tests, and then in there I put the companion test file. So I'll have the exact same name, just with the .test.js extension. That would be expenses.test.js. So now if I want to find the test file for this one, it's really easy. I just go into the actions expenses folder in tests, and there it is. I can also easily find the non-test version if I am at a test file. I just know I need to go into source actions expenses. So we have this file in place, and the goal is to actually write some test cases. But before we can do that, we have to figure out how we can access these 3 functions. What are we going to do? We're just going to import them like we would have inside of our code. So we do have access to ES6 and ES7 features depending on how we set up Babel. These just test files are run through our Babel setup. So in our case, we are going to be able to use all of those great features we've been using so far throughout the course. That means I'm going to be importing 3 things off of the import. That is going to be add expense. I'm also going to grab edit expense. And last up, I will grab remove expense. And I'm going to grab all of these from where? Well, we need to go up 2 folders. I have to go out of actions and out of tests. So .. // From here, we're in the source folder. I'm going to go into actions, and inside of actions, we want the expenses file. So now we actually have all of the imports. And just like we did before, the goal is to call our functions and assert something about the return value. Now in this case, the functions were defined up above. Now we have the functions defined in a separate file. So all we need to do is call those 3 action generators in some test cases, and then we'll be done. I'm going to be kicking things off by testing one of the easier action generators in this file. We're going to start with remove expense, then we'll move on to edit expense, and finally we'll tackle add expense. So step 1 is going to be to call test. Right here, I'm going to call test. I am going to pass in a string, and we are going to set up a name for this test. Should set up remove expense action object. Then we can define our arrow function as the second argument to test. This is where we put our test case code, and just like we did over here, the goal is to call some function and assert something about what comes back. So I'm going to do just that. I am going to create a variable to store the returned action object. I can call this action. I'm going to set its value based off of what comes back from calling remove expense, and I need to call remove expense with the necessary arguments. In this case, we are expecting it to be called with an object that has the ID property. So what am I going to do? I'm going to pass in an object with the ID property. And I can set this equal to whatever string I like. I'll just use 1, 2, 3, A, B, C. Perfect. So we have a call made to remove expense, and now we're just going to assert something about the action. So we can use expect, and we can expect the action to be something else. Now I'm going to use to be, and I'm going to pass in the object we would expect to get back. So what would we expect on this object? I would expect to have a type property set equal to remove expense. I would also expect to have an ID property set equal to 1, 2, 3, A, B, C. And this is what should be coming back. Then there's something important to note about to be. To be is actually not going to work for this code. So if I go ahead and save the file, the test suite is going to rerun, and over here you can see we're getting an error. Should set up remove expense action object. We expected the value, and we have the one that we expected, and we have the one that we received, and you can see that they're actually the same. So what's happening here? Well, when we use triple equals to compare 2 objects, we're never going to find that they're equal. The exact same thing would be true if we were to mess around with this over in the Chrome console or something like that. So I'm going to switch over to the Chrome console for just a moment. I will crack it open. And if I just check if an object equals another object, we're always going to get false, and the same thing is true with an array. So what we need to do instead is check the properties on those objects and see if they're all equal. And lucky for us, the expect assertion library that comes with Jest does support this. So we can pull that up in the documentation. What we're looking for is the toEqual method. So we can find that down below. ToEqual is actually going to go over your array or object and assert that all of the properties are the same. Here they're using ToEqual to compare two objects. That is exactly what we're trying to do as well. So all we need to do is switch back to the terminal, and inside of Visual Studio Code, we're going to switch ToB over to ToEqual. So when we're using objects or arrays, we want to use ToEqual. If we're using Booleans, numbers, or strings, we can continue to use ToB. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. That is going to correctly iterate over all of the properties of our object. And in the end of the day, what do we have? We have our passing test cases. Right here, you can see we have our two test suites. We have the one from the add test file and one from the expenses test file. Now let's move on to testing something else. What we're going to test next is going to be edit expense, and this is actually going to be your challenge. So you're going to write a single test case that makes sure edit expense returns the correct stuff. Note there are two arguments you have to pass in, the ID and the updates object. Then you're going to use ToEqual to make an assertion about what you got back. So right here, you will set up the test case. You are going to have to go ahead and call edit expense. Then you're going to need to do one more thing, which is to actually make an assertion. So make an assertion. Now for the actual updates object, you could just set something like this where you have a new note value, for example. You can update any of the properties, but a single simple updates object like this would get the job done. So take some time to try to add this new test case and write your assertion using ToEqual. Then save your test case and see what happens inside of the Jest output in the terminal. Take some time to knock this out, test your work, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? I'm going to kick things off by setting up the test case right here. Test should set up edit expense action object. So hopefully we do actually get that action object back, and we're going to go ahead and call the edit expense action generator right inside of here. So const action gets its value from whatever comes back from edit expense. We need to pass in those two arguments. So the first one is the ID. I can just use 1, 2, 3, ABC again. The second one is the updates object. So I'm going to provide that as well. Setting note equal to whatever I like. I can pass in a string for note, new note value. I could have also updated other properties like description, created at, or amount. So now we have our call in place, and the only thing left to do is to make our assertion. I'm going to expect something about the action object. What am I going to expect? I'm going to expect it to equal the following object. So on this object, we're going to have a few things. First up, we are going to have a type equal to edit expense. We are then going to have an ID equal to whatever ID we used above. And then finally, we're going to have an updates object, and that is going to have a single property on it, note, with a value of new note value. Now, if I go ahead and save the expenses test file, we should be able to see all of our tests passing. Over here, we have 5 passing tests. We have 2 from this file and 3 from this file. Now, if we did have an incorrect nested object value, that would indeed get picked up. So let me go ahead and make a bad assertion, value with 2 E's. If I save the file, you can see that ToEqual does pick up changes on those nested objects as well. Right here, it's warning us exactly of what went wrong. So now that we have this in place, we're going to move on to the more complex action generator, which is add expense. And for this one, we're going to write 2 test cases. We're going to write one that makes sure if we pass values in, those values get used. And we're going to write another that makes sure the default values actually get set up correctly when nothing is passed in. So let's go ahead and kick this off together. Down below, we can remove the challenge comments, and we can add a brand new call to test right here. I'm going to set up the name for this test case. We can use something like should set up add expense action object. with provided values. So with this one, we will pass some values in. We can then set up the function for the test case. And before we actually fill that out, we can add the other one. So this test case is going to see what happens when we rely on the defaults. So it should set up the add expense action object with default values. And we'll set up the arrow function for that one as well. So now we have both of the test functions in place, and all we have to do is actually kick the process off. So right here, I'm going to kick things off by defining the data that I'm going to pass in to add expense. So we need to pass in some information. We're going to be passing in an object with 4 properties. I'll define that first. So const expense data. Then I'm going to go ahead and actually define all of the expense data. So what values do I want to use? I can set description equal to something. I will use the value of rent. I can then go ahead and set amount equal to something. I'll use $1,095, tossing 2 zeros on the end, 4 cents. Next up would be something like created at. For created at, we can set this equal to any number. I'm going to use 1,000 seconds, 1 second, 1,000 milliseconds into the year 1970. And finally, note, and I will just say something like this was last month's rent. So we have the expense data in place. Now we're going to go ahead and actually pass it into the add expense action generator. Const action equals whatever comes back from that thing. Then we pass in the data, the expense data. Now, the goal here is to make an assertion, right? But we have a different situation than we've had before. In the past, we knew exactly what was going to come back, and we could write assertions that directly matched that. But what we have up here is actually not that. What we have up here is something dynamic. So we have this ID property. This ID property is going to change every single time we call add expense. It's randomly generated and it's unique. So we can't actually add this into equal because we don't know what it's going to equal. So to work around this, we're going to have to learn a new trick. Let's get started with the stuff that we do know. We are going to expect the action to equal, since we're comparing 2 objects, and it's going to equal an object, obviously. And in here, we can start providing the properties that are static. So first up is type, add expense. It's going to work out very well. Then we can add on the expense object itself. On here, we have the things that we provided up above. Now we can just spread out expense data, ... expense data. And the other thing we need to add is ID. So this is the dynamic one. Now we can't leave it off because if we left it off, the test case would fail. And we can go ahead and actually prove that. If I save the expense test file without referencing ID, you can see it's shown up as missing. We received it, but we didn't expect it. That's a problem. So if we do try to provide a value for ID, we don't really have something we can type. I can't just type in the ID because it changes every single time the test case runs. So what do? Well, we can actually use a function that expect gives us access to. If we scroll up to the very top where we have the table of contents, we're going to be using expect.any. This allows us to just assert something about the type. So we could say, hey, we expect this to be an object, a Boolean, a number, a string, whatever we want. In our case, we just want to assert that the ID is a string. We really don't care what the value is since we know that value is subject to change. If we click this, we can see an example. Down below, they expect a mock function, something we'll talk about later, to be called with, and this is the important part, they're expecting a number. They don't care what the number is, just that it is a number. So we pass the constructor for the thing into expect.any. In our case, it's going to be a string, so let's go ahead and knock that out. I'll switch to the terminal and over to Visual Studio Code. Right here, we will use expect.any, so we're expecting the ID to be any uppercase S string. Now, if we go ahead and actually save the expenses test file, once again, all of our test cases are passing. We did get back all of the data we explicitly set up, and we did indeed get a string back for ID, so this test is now considered a success. The last one we want to test is what happens when we pass nothing into add expense. Now, this is actually going to be your challenge for the video. Challenge 2. You are going to have to call add expense with no data, and then you are going to assert the value of the return object. So you're going to make some assertions about that return object. There are going to be the static things. In our case, the static things will be the type and all of the defaults. You can just use those values over in your test file, and there'll be the one dynamic thing ID. So take some time to add the call to the action generator and the assertion, and then test your work. If the test doesn't pass right away, try to use the error messages over inside of the just output to fix the test case. Either way, take a moment to pause the video, give this an honest try, and when you're done, click play. All right, how'd that one go? I'm going to kick things off by creating a const action and calling addExpense with no arguments. Then I'm going to assert something about that, expecting action to equal, since we're comparing objects. Now, what are we expecting it to equal? An object with the following. First up is type. The type is going to be the type we used above, that is add_expense. Then we are going to have our expense object, and on there we have various properties. The first one is ID. We don't know what ID is, we just know it's going to be a string. So we will use expect.any to set that up. Right here, string. Now, the next thing we're going to do is actually take care of the default values. So we have an empty description and note. We have amount and created at 0. First up is description, empty string, then note, empty string, then amount, 0, then created at 0. And that is it. This is all we needed to do to get the test case set up. I'm going to remove the challenge comments, save the file, and right here we can see our entire test suite is still passing. So there we have it. That is it for this video. In this one, we wrote 4 test cases for our 3 action generators. We learned about a few new things that expect provides to us as well. We learned about toEqual, which is a great way to compare objects, and we learned about expect.any, which is a way to assert something about the type of a value if you don't actually know what the value is going to be. And this works really well for our ID, which is going to change every single time we actually call addExpense. So that is it for this video. We're going to continue testing in the next one, so stay tuned and I'll see you soon.